Good morning. It is good to be gathered with you again this morning on this very special day. It is Father's Day, and we give thanks for the men in our lives that have helped us, supported us, nurtured us along the way. We give thanks for the men in our lives that are important to us. And let us take the time today to give a special thank you to those men. Today, we are going to be continuing learning about the stories that we find in the book of Daniel. Today, our story is about communication, and the story is found in chapter 5 in the book of Daniel, and it's called Daniel and the Writing on the Wall. Before we get into the story, let us light our Christ candle as we do every time that we gather. Lighting our Christ candle is a reminder that Jesus is the light of the world and that Jesus is with us wherever we go, and a reminder to shine our lights wherever we go in this world. We give good thanks because our children's worship coordinator, Linda, is with us again on this video to share our Daniel story, a continuation of the story that she shared last week. Thank you, Linda, for sharing this story.
Hi, everybody. I'm here to tell you the story this week, and it is another story from the book of Daniel. We've been talking about the book of Daniel for a couple weeks now. We've been discussing stories that happened hundreds of years before Jesus was born when Daniel lived in Babylon. And Daniel had had a number of interactions with a king called Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar was a great king. Even Daniel said he was a great king. And he had had a lot of conversations with Nebuchadnezzar over the years about God. And God had sent a couple of times, he had told Nebuchadnezzar, sent messages to Nebuchadnezzar to remind him that although he was a great and powerful king, the reason he was a great and powerful king was because of God. And it was important that Nebuchadnezzar not forget about that. And Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson, and he got it, and he got that message. And so he was king for a very long time. But eventually he died, and his son, Belshazzar, became king. And Belshazzar had been around this whole time, had been through all of the things with Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar, but he didn't learn that lesson. And when he became king, he decided, sometime after he'd become king, that people maybe weren't impressed enough with him. So he was going to have a huge party so that everybody could see that he was the most powerful, richest, greatest king in the entire world. And so he had a huge party. There were 1,000 people at this party. They had fancy food, they had fancy decorations, they had lots of special rare meals. There was music. It was a wonderful party, and everybody was having a wonderful time. And during the party, Belshazzar decided he needed to impress people more. And so he sent his servants to go and get some goblets and cups that had been stored from when Babylon had defeated Jerusalem in battle and taken these items from the temple. And these were holy, sacred cups and goblets that had been dedicated to God. And they had been safely stored, but Belshazzar decided he was going to show them to people so that they could see how rich and powerful he was. And then, having shown them to people, he decided he was going to use them. And so he had his servants put wine into the cups and goblets, and he had them serve his guests. And then, on top of this insult to God, Belshazzar and his guests started making silly toasts to the various statues and thanking them for all of their wonderful gifts, which did not really please God at all. And so eventually, in the midst of all this silliness, a hand appeared. Human hand appeared and started to write on one of the walls. And we're told that when the hand appeared, Belshazzar was terrified. He went pale, he was trembling, he had to sit down, he was freaking out. And his guests knew that this couldn't be good, and they left. The party was over. Belshazzar was left alone with the writing on the wall. And he didn't know what it meant. He couldn't read it. He didn't understand it. So he called a whole bunch of his wise people, his fortune tellers, people who said they could tell the future, people who said who they could interpret signs. And he called them and he asked them to tell him what the words meant. And he told them that anyone who could tell him what the words meant would be given fancy clothes and expensive jewelry and be made the third most important person in Babylon. But despite all of this incentive, none of his people could tell him what the writing meant. And so Belshazzar was once again left alone with the writing on the wall. And the queen came in and she said, I heard what happened at the party, and I heard about the writing. And I was thinking, did you ask Daniel? Because, when your dad was king, whenever he had a problem, he always asked Daniel, and Daniel could always figure it out. And Belshazzar said, yeah, that's actually a good idea. I'm going to call Daniel. So he called Daniel in. And Daniel came to see him, and he said, okay, Daniel, if you could tell me what this writing on the wall means, I will give you fancy clothes. I will give you expensive jewelry. I will make you the third most powerful person in Babylon. And Daniel was not impressed. Daniel said, you can keep your gifts. I don't want fancy clothes. I don't want fancy jewelry. And I don't need to be the third most important person in Babylon. God has told me what the writing means, and I'm happy to tell you, but I don't want your gifts. So Belshazzar said, okay, tell me, what does it mean? And Daniel said, your dad was king, and your dad was a great king, and your dad was the most powerful person on earth, and your dad could do whatever he wanted, but he understood that power came from God. He learned that lesson. You did not learn that lesson. And as a result, that writing on the wall means three things. 1, you're not going to be king anymore. 2, God is displeased with you. And 3, your kingdom, the biggest kingdom on earth, is going to be broken and shared by 2 different nations. So this was not good news. Belshazzar said, okay, well, I promised you clothes and I promised you jewelry, and everybody put out a big message. Daniel's now the third most important person in Babylon. He kept his word to Daniel, but he was not happy. And sure enough, that night, that very night, the night of the party, Babylon was defeated in battle. Belshazzar was no longer king, and Babylon was split between 2 nations. And a new king, King Darius, who was not even Babylonian, became king. And that is the story of Daniel and the king of Babylon. So I was thinking about this story, and I was wondering some stuff about the story. I was wondering, what do you think Belshazzar thought when he saw the writing? I mean, he couldn't understand the writing, but he knew it couldn't be good. What do you think he thought maybe it meant? And I was also wondering, if Daniel was such a great advisor for his dad, why didn't Belshazzar use Daniel as an advisor? If Daniel had been invited to the party, do you think any of that would have happened? I was wondering about those things. And the story today, the theme of the story, we've talked about communication, and part of that is the message on the wall and how difficult that is to understand and how it needs to be interpreted. But part of communication is really trying to listen and trying to understand. And Belshazzar had plenty of time while his dad was a king to learn the lessons and the communication that God was making. Belshazzar chose not to do that. And I think sometimes we're like that. When we say we don't understand someone, when we have trouble communicating with other people, maybe we're not really trying that hard. There's a video clip in the lesson plan that Marilyn's going to talk about, and it's from a movie called Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's about a boy named Flint who's an inventor and his dad who's a fisherman. And all the way through the movie, whenever Flint's dad tries to give him any advice or comfort or just talk to him, Flint doesn't understand because his dad talks in fishing metaphors, because his dad's a fisherman and he talks in fishing metaphors. And Flint always after a few seconds says, "Dad, I don't understand fishing metaphors," and he runs away, ends the conversation. But I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, Flint's a pretty smart guy. He's an inventor. Do you think if he put all of his effort and his creativity, all of the thinking that he does into inventing things, into trying to figure out a fishing metaphor, you think maybe he could have managed? I think maybe he could have. And that made me think about something else. That made me think about someone that we talk about at church quite a bit, who talked a lot in fishing metaphors, and how sometimes his friends didn't understand what he was talking about either. But they tried, and we try today. And so I want you to remember, in communication, a lot of it is about what's being said, but sometimes it's about really trying to understand. See you next week.
Linda, thank you for the way that you shared that story and the way that you have taught us what it means to communicate with one another and the importance of that. I have included the video clip that Linda referred to in the lesson plans, and we will put that video clip on our worship and bulletin notices so that you can find it that way as well. That's an opportunity to respond to the story. Linda has also prepared in those lesson plans a number of other different activities and crafts. One of them is a Father's Day craft, and I like what she did with it because the craft is the opportunity to give this craft to a special male in your life. And it involves writing and communication about why that special person is important to you. There is a whiteboard craft to remind us of the writing on the wall. There are some coloring pages. There's also some games you can play together with your family that help with communication. Oftentimes when we think of communication, we think of verbal communication. And that's not always the only way that we can communicate. We can communicate through our body language, our facial expressions. There's some fun games that you can play to help communicate different things, like Pictionary, like drawing pictures, or charades, which help, again, communicate through our body movements. So that's some fun ways that you can respond to our theme of communication. Let us pray. God, we give you thanks for Daniel and what Daniel has taught us today. The importance of communicating with one another, the importance of communicating and helping people do that. God, we invite and ask you to continue to be with us wherever we go, because sometimes it's hard to communicate how we feel. Sometimes it's hard to communicate what we are thinking. God, so give us the strength and the courage to do that so we can help better understand others, and in turn, they can better understand who we are. God, we give you thanks for the men in our lives. We give you thanks for all they are and all they mean to us. Amen. And as we watch the smoke in the air We give thanks knowing that God is always with us, that God walks with us in our lives, in our joys and our sorrows. See you next week.